The first big climax of the Fontaine Archon quest is here, and along with the world quests this update brought in, we've got so much to talk about that I decided to try an entirely different format for how I organize things per video. I like to try to stay on one or two topics in general, but there's just so much to cover, and a lot of it updates and recontextualizes things we already know or have speculated on for a long time. With this in mind, my recommended reading from the Hex and Circle archives would be my videos on the Celestial Nails as well as the Dragon Sovereigns, along with the text, or my handy-dandy audiobook of said text, of the whole of the Byakuya Koku collection. I always give a blanket spoiler warning, but today we are really well and truly entering the major spoiler zone, and I will be directly talking about and referencing several key bits of information we gained directly from the 4.2 and 4.1 Archon quests, as well as side quests and world quests. So if you don't want spoilers, now's your chance to go finish up Fontaine. Good luck, friend. Reminder that my preferred method of theory crafting is finding connections in the information we have in the game itself, and then extrapolating on those connections to the greater Hoyoverse and occasionally beyond. I don't theory craft to try to predict the game's story, and at the end of the day, I don't really care much if I'm right or not. I just think storytelling is really cool. This time, I'm not really doing sections, it's a bit more flow of thought and structure. If anything, it'll be in two parts: questions I had that were answered, and questions I have after the fact. This will probably be a bit messy and disorganized, and I'll be going back to things from Byakuya Koku all the way back to Salvin Dagner. I am the humble scribe of the Hex and Circle, Ganymede, and today I'll be your guide to, well, not anything specific, but a wide-ranging Fontaine lore roundup. Today, you'll probably actually hear a lot of my own harebrained theories for a change, rather than just information gathering, so look forward to it. First up on the menu, let's talk about the elephants in the room. Thanks to Skirk and Neuillette, we can now finally pin down some of the biggest questions we've been asking about gnosis and even visions. Before we do anything else, let's just go over some of the information we were given. This opens up some other lesser known info that tells us something huge. The state of the world of Teyvat is in flux. It's changing right before our eyes, and we don't really know what that means yet. Celestia itself is looming large and spookily on the not-so-distant anymore horizon. So, through interaction with Skirk, Neuillette learned what the gnosis are made of, and it's pretty dark. Skirk informed him that she could smell the curse of a god mixed in with his natural dragony scent, identifying it rather easily as the remains of the third descender. Even Neuillette was completely in the dark about this, as it took him a moment to realize that she meant the Gnosis, which he had just received from Focalor. That leads us back to what we already know about Descenders, thanks to Nahida's timely information. The term Descender was used primarily by the Fatui at that point, but now it seems that even people who have never or very rarely leave the Abyss for the surface world, such as Skirk, use the same term, which suggests the Fatui have gotten this information directly from the Abyss. Of course, it's important to separate the Abyss and the Abyss Order, and I will try to be clear whether I'm talking about one or the other. As we learned from Jacob Ingold, many other abyssal occultists might consider the Abyss Order a fringe organization, filled with religious zealots. While the Abyss Order operate through and within the Abyss, it seems that they are not the top authority within, and may operate in secret even within the Abyss considered their home turf. Anyway, back to the Descenders themselves. Nahida told us that the Traveler is the fourth Descender, and her best guess is that the first Descender is the Heavenly Principles. This checks out with what we've read in the Byakuya Koku collection. Neuillette is also completely cognizant of this fact, referring to the Heavenly Principles as the Usurper, who came and stole the power of the ancient Dragon Sovereigns, one of whom he is the reincarnation of. This is of great interest in and of itself, because we know that Urabashi, the god of Enkanomiya, and the people of Sangonomiya Island, read the book Before Sun and Moon from the Byakuya Koku collection at some point, which contains the same information that Neuillette seems to know, and he was sentenced to death by Celestia for it. The Electro Archon later carried out the sentence. By this reasoning, the second who came would be the second descender, though we don't know this for certain. But who is the third, and how did they die? Why is the third descender not the traveler's twin? Even worse, is the third descender the traveler's twin, and the one we've seen so far is only an echo of time or an imposter? The implications lead us into dark territory pretty fast. This also tells us that characters that many people have speculated to be descenders probably are not, such as Alice, Zhongli, and even Fischl. The conversation where Neuillette tells the traveler what he learned leads to a brief moment where Neuillette idly muses whether the traveler's body is of the same composition as the third descender's, and Paimon suggests that it could be his ability to use the elements of Teyvat without a vision, but quickly cuts herself off, calling the conversation bad luck. That tells me that this line of thinking is definitely foreshadowing for something, but what? We hear a lot of talk about what the truth of Teyvat is, and we already see a lot of things pointing to Teyvat and its history being cyclical. Perhaps this too is something related to that cycle. This is the bit of lore that always feels like something is right there on the tip of your tongue and you can't quite reach it. One thing that sprang to mind was the possibility that even the traveler and their twin are intrinsic parts of this cycle, and every time Teyvat repeats the cycle, so do they. We still don't have enough information to be sure about anything though, as usual. One of the many theories about this, and possibly my most harebrained one, is one that involves the story of the Pale Princess and the Six Pygmies. The theories about this book series have been many and extremely creative, and involve some forbidden knowledge we're not supposed to have yet, if you know what I mean. So I'm not going to cover them too in depth. However, looking back at it now, I think, what if the Prince of Light was the third descender, and perhaps also the Outlander that wed a Seelie? We know what happened to the Seelie race and the three Moon Sisters who were likely their rulers or gods. The ancestor Seelie, as she was called, was punished by having her memory and consciousness removed or sealed away, shed into the many husks we see around the world. In contrast, we do not know what happened to the Outlander. If we look at the story through a new lens, though, and assume that the Prince of Light is a descender much like Ether, we get the story of an Outlander who came to explore the world of Teyvat, met a pale princess, and after meeting six pygmies, was betrayed and killed by them. Interesting also is the fact that now there are only 6 archons and 6 thrones in the heavens rather than the initial 7. If Teyvat is cyclical, then a throne of the 7 is likely destroyed every cycle. And what did we learn about using riddles and stories to preserve information even when Irminsul is rewritten or reset? This information about the Gnosis also brings to mind some of the experiments done by the Fatui where human subjects were involved, and Colet's story in the webtoon gives us a little insight into that. We found out back in Sumeru that the Fatui's delusions, counterfeit visions, are created through a process that involves processing the remains of dead gods somehow. We also know that beasts that consume the flesh of dead gods in the wild can mutate and evolve into consecrated beasts. To me, this makes it clear that yet again the Tsaritsa and her merry band of fools are playing 4D chess on a level that would make our heads spin. Either by arcane means, perhaps the forays into the abyss that Scaramouche mentioned are connected to this, or through reverse engineering, the Fatui have known for a very long time that the Gnosis were created in this manner. The ending of the story of the Princess and the Pygmies involves the one pygmy that felt guilt for what they'd done, helping to set in motion a prophecy. That prophecy involves the murdered prince being brought back to life by a hero in shining armor, and that the prince would then finally rescue the Pale Princess. So, you know how we don't know why the Tsaritsa wants all of the Archon's Gnosis at any cost? Yeah. While Dottore has his own agenda and only cares about his research and what he personally finds interesting, it's clear that he has a bent towards this particular subject with the Gnosis. They've known all along how the Gnosis were made, and it seems that they've put countless hours of manpower and human lives on the table in order to succeed at making something of equal power, as they did in creating delusions. And they've been making delusions at the very least since shortly after the fall of Conria, if the story of Piero giving Signora a cryo-delusion to suppress the crimson moth of flames inside her is any indication. I think it's also very clever that in real life, the things that drive most human beings can be categorized into either visions or delusions. Either can drive a person and fuel their ambition, but one is pure, like having a simple dream, and the other is based in deception of the self. I'm sure there's something that plays into Gnosticism with that, but that level of esotericism is a little above my pay grade. To further expand on what we learned about visions and gnosis this patch, I'd like to now dive into Neuillette's character stories. There is a ton of information hidden in here, and people without him and his friendship levels unlocked might miss out on it entirely. To be honest, I couldn't really stand to pick and choose, so I'm going to read out the relevant ones here. First off, Neuillette's character story, Vision. Neuillette does not need a vision to manipulate the elements. However, there were some things he learned only after regaining his complete form. Severely wounded in the Great War of Vengeance, the usurper had their functions ruined and could no longer use their absolute authority to suppress the original order of this world. To continue to subdue and control the resentment and loathing of the world, the usurper and the one who came after created the Gnosis together. So it came to be that an order was made to be upheld, and thus did humans come to only possess these 7 remembrances, and all fragments of the primordial were driven to devour each other. From that day on, whenever a person's wishes reached the heavens, the 7 overseers of the material realm were duty-bound to grant them a gift, though they might know nothing of who or what wish had stepped into the threshold of the sacred. The 7 Archons still had to impart a shattered shard of their mastery to that person, and when one so gifted completed their duty, the gift the gods would receive in return would be more abundant still. Neuillette obeys no edict from the heavens, but he does acknowledge human will, so he too set aside parts of himself as like unto the dragon treasure hoards of old, awaiting valiant humans to come and claim them. Calling the Archons the rulers of the material realm once again harkens back to Gnosticism. That pretty much checks out with the Gnostic idea of an Archon. Good to see them bringing that back to reiterate it. Overall, there's been much debate out there about how visions are awarded and why and when and so on and so forth. First of all, we confirm that visions were not a part of the original natural order and are a system implemented by Celestia and the Institution of the Seven. We can definitely confirm some widely held suspicions about allogenes. Just as in many forms of polytheism, I think of ancient Taoism specifically, the Archons are at least in part powered by the faith of their worshippers. While this seems to be a negligible effect when referring to the average Joe de Fontaine, this tells us that each vision is a sliver of the Archon who oversees that element's power. For a while, we thought the process was more mysterious than this, as Raiden A seemed surprised that no new Electro visions appeared while the Vision Hunt decree was enacted, and the other Archons we knew at the time also suggested that they didn't know who got visions from them or why. This character story teaches us that, much like I theorized in an older video on the subject, there seems to be an almost automated system in place. When wishes reach the heavens, the Archons are bound by their duty to grant that person a gift. Though it's not clear how those wishes get sent off to one Archon or another, as there are clearly vision wielders of nearly every type in every nation, save for a few outstanding cases. Where, oh where, are the Dendrovisions in Mondstadt, for instance? It almost seems like this works kind of like getting anonymous requests. You don't know who's asking or why, but it's your job to respond with the promised reward. Even the Archons themselves don't seem to know just what the qualifications are. We still don't know why some strong wishes are enough and others aren't, but that, I think, has something to do with the cycle of samsara in Teyvat. The process of receiving a vision reminds me of the Taoist concept of being able to ascend to the heavens if one was pious or heroic enough and managed to gain enough spiritual power. Being the kind of thing that ends up seeping into the roots of a culture, I think it's safe to say the two are a parallel idea. We of course have precedents for this with the tales of how Lady Vanessa eventually ascended to Celestia. These concepts of celestials, immortal, incorruptible humans who became godlike or actual gods through cultivation and martial arts are extremely common in Chinese folklore and even modern popular fiction in China. What concerns me about the process as revealed through this is the obvious fridge horror. Neuillette says, "And when one so gifted completed their duty, the gift the gods would receive in return would be more abundant still." This suggests that those that receive a vision become bound by a pact as well, though it doesn't seem that any of them know what terms they agreed to, and when they inevitably die, the sliver of Archon power given to them returns to the Archon stronger than it was before. I'm almost sure I saw a theory floating around somewhere about Allegenes, the vision wielders, being some form of battery for Celestia, and this kind of leans into that. However, Neuillette goes on to say he's prepared to do the same, and in fact has already awarded his first vision to the newly made human, Farina. The vision he awarded looks slightly different from all of the others in Fontaine, so we can assume that a vision's case design reflects its giver in some way. We don't have a direct explanation for why these visual changes take place, and they don't explain folks who have slightly different vision cases as part of their design, or why they do it all. The only confirmation we have is that they vary within the same element depending on the giver, probably. Neuillette may just be a special case because he's a sovereign and not an Archon. Neuillette has shown himself to be wholly benevolent so far, and I can't imagine him taking part in a practice created by his mortal enemy, especially if it proves harmful to the users in any way. He seems to have adopted the practices of the Seven that he likes and ignored those he does not. Awarding visions tickles his fancy because he's become fond of humans and their ambitions over the years. What really becomes of vision wielder's souls, and how this revelation affects the concept we have of, say, inactive visions being rekindled by new users like Ningguang and Mona, remains to be seen. Turning our attention away from the gnosis and the visions for a moment, this also drops one of the biggest bombshells in relation to the things that theory crafters have debated ever since the release of Enkanomiya and the Byakuya-koku collection. Severely wounded in the Great War of Vengeance, the usurper had their functions ruined and could no longer use their absolute authority to suppress the original order of this world. To continue to subdue and control the resentments and loathing of the world, the usurper and the one who came after created the gnosis together. So it came to be that an order was made to be upheld, and thus did humans come to only possess these 7 remembrances, and all fragments of the primordial were driven to devour each other. This is quite a lot to break down. At first glance, it seems to suggest that the primordial one, whom Neuillette refers to as the usurper, did not win the war against the second who came after all, or if it did, the victory came at a great price. Honestly, this tiny excerpt gives us so much information, but it leaves me with more questions than answers. All fragments of the primordial were driven to devour each other. Is this in reference to the primordial one and its shades, or the beings of the Vishap realm, all pure elemental beings? This also suggests that the current order of the world was created to suppress the original order, as well as the resentments and loathings of the world, which brings to question why Tevat was reshaped in the way it was at all. I imagine if the primordial one hadn't conquered and subjected the original peoples of Tevat, that there wouldn't be grudges and hate to suppress in the first place. This gives us at least some idea of Neuillette and by proxy the Dragon Sovereign's view of what happened. The primordial one that for a long time people have thought of as primarily the mostly benevolent creator of mankind due to the information in the Byakuya-koku collection, and even what Nabu Malikata, the goddess of flowers, said in the Flower of Paradise Lost artifact set seemed to not completely shake that opinion for most folks. May be a more sinister figure than we imagined. In the end, this primordial god turned out not to be undefeatable or infallible, as the 40-year war seemed to have rendered the primordial one powerless. If the last bit about the primordial being driven to consume itself is any hint, perhaps the current powers that reside in Celestia are not an equal partnership between the primordial one and the second who came. If the primordial one is still alive, I imagine it is likely a prisoner or simply in a position where it could not fight or intervene at all, and likely made this deal with the second who came in order to ensure that Tevat as we know it wouldn't unravel. But this is all conjecture, and we all have to wait for more lore bits to piece together the truth with any certainty. Just what was the second who came, and why did it do what it did? If the first descender is in fact the heavenly principles, does that mean that the unknown god we faced in the cutscenes is in fact the primordial one? Or is the primordial one not considered a descender? It starts to get pretty convoluted when we try digging into the semantics, so I figure us theory crafters are going to be puzzling this one out for some time. On the account of Neuillette's opinions on such things, another character story reveals this. Character story 5. One as great as he should have no need for a constellation to shine over him. After all, fate is merely the manner in which the present ruler of this world plays with living beings. Now that he has obtained 1 part of 7 of the authority over the mortal realm, and reforged the throne and title of a fully fledged dragon, he is one strong enough to equal and rival the human realm, and logic would dictate that he need not subscribe to this system known as fate. He can see in the skies of destiny how many stars contend with one another, creating a complicated, fragile world. He did not initially care much about such, for the puppet strings glossed as divine rules would one day be burned away by the fires of judgment. But he, too, was taken in by certain pleasing rhetoric. In that case, why don't you just watch over the Fontainians? They were born from the primordial sea, after all. That makes them part of this planet's native life, too, and a form of life that requires your care. He would never admit that he himself had become quite fascinated with the joys and sorrows of humanity. Was it not so, he would argue, that humans find their gaze stolen by the ripples from falling raindrops in puddles? And could it not be, he would explain, that King Nibelung had been wrong, and that the Black Void could only be opposed if all life were to band together as one? Thus did he, in the end, come into his own fate. The skies had left a special, ennobled place for him, one reserved for the overseers and those who could defy the world itself, that of his own reflection. Of course, he was born in the form of a human, but why, then, is his name the image of the great Leviathan? Well, this leads us to a more mundane explanation for the situation, one quite separate from the grave matters of the world's fate. As the one named Neuillette, he would often be roped by Melusines, especially Sigewinne, into a bit of astrology via the Steambird's constellation columns or astrology guides from Sumeru. Would it really do at that point to tell them that he didn't have a constellation, or that his own constellation was just Neuillette? This gives us the smallest snippet of insight into Nibelung, the former Dragon King's plan and intentions, resisting the Black Void, likely the Abyss. Only we know that the dragons rejected and despised the usurper and its creations, effectively trying to stand alone against the storm. According to Apep and the history we have available to us, Nibelung's war caused great destruction to the land through the spreading of forbidden knowledge, and is in part a reason why the heavenly principles dropped the celestial nails in order to restabilize the land. This character story tells us something else, or confirms what many of us have already inferred. The Archons and Scaramouche, and perhaps Albedo, as well as the Traveler, are the only playable characters with humanoid constellations resembling themselves, and usually bearing a Latin version of their true name or title. For example, Zhongli's Lapis Dei, God of Stone. Nahida is Sapientia or Omazdis, which is a bit convoluted, but references Ahura Mazda, the God of Wisdom, which she is. And Ventis is Carbon Dei, the God of Song. This character story tells us that Neuillette's constellation is exactly the same as theirs, despite his being in the shape of an elegant serpentine dragon. So, these special constellations depicting oneself are reserved for those that are overseers and those who could defy the world itself. It also seems that his intention to keep his true nature a secret affected the form that his constellation took. He couldn't just tell the Melusines who wanted to play at astrology that his constellation was himself, as that is something generally reserved for Archons. that would have just ended up with a bunch more speculation about who the true Archon of Fontaine was, which he was pretty sick to death of at that point. It seems that, simply by wishing it, his constellation took the form of a true dragon rather than his human form. Interestingly, when discussing the form of the constellation, this story seems to suggest that the name of one's constellation does have a direct impact on one's actual name, which is corroborated by the constellations of the Archons themselves. But why then is his name the image of the Great Leviathan? We know that Neuillette is only his surname, and I think this suggests pretty heavily that his first name might be Leviathan. Further suggesting this, his name has been hinted at since his introduction, the title of which was He Who Looks Down on All That Are Haughty. It's likely a reference to the verse Job 41:34 in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, which is a direct reference to the biblical Leviathan. The dragon that formerly lived in Fontaine in direct connection with the god Remus was named Scylla, and may have been, and I mean a big maybe taken with a grain of salt, Neuvillette's previous incarnation. And as there are hints that we'll be exploring the sunken kingdom of Remuria soon enough, I hope we find out more about him then. It's also especially likely that our second story quest for Fontaine will be Neuvillette's rather than Furina's for obvious reasons, so I'm hoping that the two are in fact connected somehow. Last but not least, this leaves us with a tiny little crumb about divine thrones. We know that the Hydro-Archon's throne has been destroyed. This tells us that Neuillette reforged his own throne. This is connected to the title of being a fully fledged dragon, but beyond that we don't really know what constitutes a throne of authority, or how they are created. All we know now for sure is that they can be destroyed, even though it took the collective energy of 500 years in Demnidium, pure belief in justice, to topple one, and is therefore not likely to happen again, perhaps until the very end of the story. Who knows? Having brought up indemnitium, I think it's likely that it comes from the word indemnity, which is a legalese term associated with security against damage, loss, or injury, an exemption from liability for damages resulting from specified conduct, as in a contract indemnifying a party for the performance of certain actions, compensation for damage, loss, or injury suffered. While we're talking about Neuillette, let's also get to another pretty big lore bomb slipped casually into his third character story. Due to a variety of reasons, Fontaine's legal codices retain all manner of odd articles from days past. Neuillette himself contributed this clause: a Melusine shall be addressed as she, rather than it, for they are people too. This might look strange on its face, but the more one considers it, the more it makes sense. After all, Melusines have been found all over Fontaine since near modern times, and fighting for equal rights for them, beginning with terms of address, sent a powerful signal. Indeed, Fontainians have noticed that Neuillette displays different amounts of warmth toward Melusines and humans. Most regard this as the understated goodness in his heart having found an outlet, becoming the love of a father. Oddly enough, this one only gets stranger the more one knows about Neuillette. For he is the Hydro Dragon, and in this capacity, he regards Melusines as dependents and successors, and also as the finest example of a new sort of Hydro Vishaps species. Yet he is also the destroyer of the present order, and one who shall judge all gods, and the foe of humanity. So why then did he secure human rights for the Melusines? You alone could ask him this question, and this was his reply. It wasn't up to me. Melusines simply prefer being around humans. That's all. On top of reiterating what was mentioned in the previous character story I covered, that the divine rules of the heavenly principles would one day be burned away in the fires of judgment, and that he is the one that shall judge all gods, likely the heavenly principles included, it drops the shocker that Melusines, in all of their cute, fluffy, doe-like glory, are in fact a species of Vishap. At first glance, this is just a simple, apt answer to the question of what they are, but to those of us who have been obsessed with the information in the Byakuyakoku collection since its initial reveal, this went off more like a bomb, honestly. I think back to the last section, the Book of Riddles for Children, that involves an adaptation of the classic riddle, what walks on 4 legs, then 2, then 3? The answer to the original is of course a man, as it simply represents how a person crawls as a baby, then walks upright as an adult, and then walks with a cane in old age. The entry about it in the book reads thus: a Vishap who transforms into a person to attend a ball, then breaks one of its legs and eventually ends up walking with a cane. Sages like this answer the most, and it is the children who get it right almost exclusively. For adults, it always smells like a horrible conspiracy when a Vishap turns into a human. According to a prophecy of old, the Dragon of Water, the ancient lord of Vishaps, will definitely descend in the form of a human. However, for children, the answer to the question indicates the possibility of mutual understanding, but it is not a good idea to make Vishaps sound adorable. Though such jokes defang the fear, they also lower the guard of the children. Dragon heirs of the depths have evolved to wield the power of other elements and have since lost their purity. As such, the Dragon of Water will no longer be born from among their ranks. After revisiting that, it feels a little like Neuillette's unique, singular existence has been teased in more ways than simply the idea of the Sovereign of Water being reborn as a human. It seems that they predicted even his cane. If that's the case, this seemingly inconsequential passage even seems to tease the present that we now know. That Vishaps would change to be something adorable, and that even children would be able to play with them without fear, and that the races would gain a mutual understanding. If Melusines are Vishaps, then this is the exact reality in the land of Fontaine, especially shown by how much the people of Fontaine love and respect them, and are willing to protect them. See Neuillette's story quest. And it's not the only thing involving Vishaps that this patch dropped on us. Stepping back just slightly, even before Neuillette's identity was confirmed, the first thing I noticed about his design was the fact that his eyes, in shape and the color around the edges of his pupil, as well as the type of lower lashes he has, were similar to that of the average Bathysmal Vishap. In 4.2, a new world quest, the Wild Fairy of Arrhenius, introduces us to a Melusine called Passive. Throughout the quest you do for her, she manages to drop quite a bit of information if you can sift through her stilted language. First of all, she was born on Arrhenius, unlike all of the other Melusine who are born of Elenus's body on the other island. She says that a bad purple thing is doing something to Arrhenius and that she and the Visitor protect Arrhenius. In the original Chinese, the phrase that Passive uses to refer to the Visitor is almost a perfect homonym for Neuillette's name, so while she drops other hints about this Visitor teaching her many things and being quite busy, unable to help all of the time, that hint to the Visitor being him, the Chinese more or less confirms it. It's a shame that this little tidbit is lost in translation because it's quite clever. There's a lot of running to and fro and solving puzzles, and then, in the little cozy overhang in the center of Loch Urania, I very nearly had a heart attack. During this part of the quest, in a very blink-or-you-miss-it moment, until Paimon forcibly points it out after the fact, there's a Bathysmal Vishap sleeping in that little rock overhang with the altar you're looking for. As you can see, I didn't even continue the quest at first, just kept going through to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Vishaps? In the sunlight, above ground? When it jumped up and attacked us, I expected the usual fight a monster and move on sort of thing, but instead of us killing it, Passive comes over and talks to it, pats its head, and it happily gives us the quest item. For the most of the rest of the quest, we're back to fighting and fetching, but at that point I was already deep in a lore fugue state. Bathysmal Vishaps on the surface! The only other time that's happened was more or less just a barely lore-accurate teaser for the new boss that would be released in Enkanomia when the event that accompanied Shenhe's leg of the Archon quest in Neuillette dropped. Other types of Vishaps have appeared, but I'd always assumed this type of Vishap was native to and more or less trapped in Enkanomia along with the humans that had fallen there. It's even stated that they don't like the light. That's the whole purpose of the Dainishi Mikoshi, to imitate the sun and force the Vishaps away to the fringes in the dark. Despite this, the Byakuya-koku collection details a gauntlet of inhumane experiments the researchers of the Hydrological Institute of Byakuya-koku did in order to learn the secrets of Vishaps as well as trying to disrupt their evolution in order to halt the prophecy that they feared, the prophecy that the slain Dragon Lord of Water would be reborn in human form. It seems that, much like in the case of the Fontanian prophecy, they may have in fact only guaranteed that the prophecy would come to pass as they tried to work against it. We know of the Dragon King Scylla, who aligned with the God King Remus and was eventually betrayed and then slain and sealed beneath the Great Tower of Remuria. This location is not yet in-game, and not to be mistaken for the replica that the Narcissan Croix Ordo built that was added in 4.2, known as the Tower of Gestalt or the Tower of Epissimus. We can't confirm one way or another whether or not Scylla was Neuillette's former incarnation, as there's evidence both for and against this. But just as when talking about Elenus, I think it's safe to say that a being can't reincarnate if its soul or presence still remains, and as Scylla was sealed after being killed before the better part of Remuria fell into the abyss mentioned here may not be the capital A abyss, but refer simply to the depths of the waters. What I'm leaning towards is the idea that Scylla was some other high-ranking Vishap and not the original sovereign at all. If my reading of these two events is correct, then neither Scylla nor Elenus can be the original Hydra sovereign. Then that suggests that the original sovereign had to have perished sometime before or during the battle against the second who came, as Enconomia had had some kind of contact with said sovereign before they were cut off from the rest of the world. Perhaps, like Istaroth, the sovereign and its baptismal Vishaps had fallen in along with the city when it sank, and was then killed at some point. What we learned in Fontaine suggests that to be a true dragon is to be the sovereign of your element among Vishaps, but we don't know how one acquires such a title or if it can be acquired, as we know that Neuillette was quite literally born into it. The same seems true of Ajdaha and Dvalin, who, I remind you, Ajdaha was discovered trapped deep underground by Morax, and Dvalin was born in the high winds above Mondstadt. I remind you that both of them ruled side by side with their Archon, much in the same way that Neuillette did with Furina, or at least now we have something to contextualize that with and see through another light. In fact, it makes the act of Venti giving Dvalin his blessing at the end of the Storm Terror sequence way back when even more poignant. Though, I guess Venti's gift wasn't as intense as, destroying his own divine throne. He's just not a go-getter like Focalor, let's be honest. The flavor text of Liyue's various Geo-Vishaps point towards them wanting to ascend to dragonhood, but also echoes this bit of Neuillette's character stories that tell us the Primordial was driven to devour each other, likely in pursuit of this. The flavor text also says that it's impossible for a common Vishap to become a dragon, further suggesting that the Sovereign's station is not one that can simply be passed on or changed at all, but is attached to their soul specifically. Again, I'm hoping that when we get to Remuria at some point in patches that these questions about Scylla and whether or not this other dragon was the former Hydro Sovereign, or how it was related to him, will be answered, further cementing our understanding of this process. Back to Passiv's quest, she leads us to a place she calls the Root of Irenaeus, and it contains many thick spectral roots that honestly look very similar to the Harvestocum back in Sumeru. The part that shocked me the most was how Irenaeus changed after completing the main part of this quest. From the central Archon statue on Irenaeus, following the river there north to the Loch of Urania, there are at least 6 baptismal Vishaps wandering around. You can fight them, and they'll fight back if you attack, but they're completely non-hostile unless you do. I believe that these two things, the Willow of the Lake whose roots are the root of the island, and the baptismal Vishaps, are tied to 2 separate presences who have been there for 500 years. Focalor, residing within the Oratrice, whose close physical presence perhaps is what made the Willow's roots into something like the Harvestocum, and of course, Neuillette. Neuillette is the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, the very prophecy that Enconomia was desperately trying to keep from coming true, or at the very least, they were desperately trying to keep it from coming true in their midst. They did not want the Sovereign to be reborn in Enconomia, and it seems that whatever strange experiments they did to warp the baptismal Vishap's evolution worked, as Neuillette obviously was born in and resides in Fontaine rather than Enconomia or Sangonomia. This means that while he is a true dragon, he is almost definitely also Vishap. I remind you that the 2 words seem almost interchangeable through most of the text and lore regarding them. The word dragon seems to refer to the sovereigns, while the word Vishap seems to be used more for the whole species from which they come. Only sovereigns can be dragons, but all sovereigns are Vishaps. Probably. At least that's my takeaway. Anyway, I mentioned earlier Neuillette's design similarities to the Baptismal Vishaps, and so my conclusion here is that while most of the Melusines are born from the genetic material that is Elenus, who was likely also a Vishap at one point before being lost to the abyss, the beings born of Arrhenius are likely Neuillette's direct descendants, and the adorable Passive is very likely the missing link that proves that Vishaps have evolved exponentially. I say this in part because during the final fight that you have to undertake in her quest, you fight a pack of Rift Wolves, and Passive mysteriously disappears, while a Baptismal Vishap joins you in the fray. She turns up again later, but Paimon is of course oblivious to what you, the player, has figured out by now. From her eyes, to the coloration of her limbs and the marks on her arms that hint at the start of fin frills, to her name, everything about Passive matches up with her Baptismal Vishap brethren. Her name is almost too heavy-handed. Passive is just Vishap spelled backwards. During this quest, it also dawned on me that the eye of the Festering Desire Sword is undeniably the same shape and color as the eyes of the Baptismal Vishap, and I feel like it leads further credence to the idea that Durin and all the dragons are of the same species. My theory about Elenus is that he's likely pyro-aspected due to the little fire-like wisps that surround his heart near Marseille village, and because the space inside of him seems to be naturally warm, according to the names the Melusine gave the different sections within. Back to Durin, he's regarded as the Shadow Dragon and Black Serpentine Dragon, and because these quest and character stories have made it clear that the actual term dragon has weight, keep in mind Ursa the Drake, who also tormented Mondstadt, was most likely not a true dragon, and my theory now is that Durin is one of the other sovereigns that we've not heard from yet. We can pretty much rest easy on the idea that Dvalin and Ajdaha are the reborn sovereigns of Anemo and Geo. And now, the much-theorized Hydro Sovereign is accounted for. Apep is the original sovereign of Dendro and endures to this day, leaving only the question of the missing Pyro, Cryo, and Electro Sovereigns. In the cutscene where Durin is shown, he's pretty obviously wreathed in flame and so possibly pyro-aspected. From what we know about Nibelung, the Dragon King, his mission for his fellow dragons and Vishaps was to amass forbidden knowledge from outside of Tevat and use that to strike back against the Usurper, the Primordial One. It wouldn't be that odd at all to think that one of the sovereigns might have become so corrupted by the Abyss that they ended up being assumed to be abyssal in nature. Durin had to have been summoned from the Abyss much in the same manner that Elenus was by Rhindaughter at the climax of the Cataclysm 500 years prior, perhaps in very poor condition. Elenus' dialogue confirms that he was not created, but pulled from the cold, dark void where he existed before his mother called him forth. I think it's safe to assume that Durin came to be in a similar way, but Rhindaughter still considered him one of her perfect crowning achievements. Due to Durin's initial skeletal appearance, perhaps it was a bit of Chemia-powered necromancy. We may never know. But with what we do know, Durin could have been any one of those three missing sovereigns or their reincarnation, so warped by the Abyss that they, like the genetically modified Vishaps of Enkanomia, could never be the pure elemental being they were before again. So, back to the Vishaps on Arrhenius. Either Passive is a special case and can switch between Vishap and Melusine form at will, or all of the Vishaps of Arrhenius hold this innate evolutionary trait, but perhaps just see no reason to use it. The texts of the Byakuya-koku collection suggest at least a colloquial belief that Vishaps can change form and even appear as humans, thus the rumor of Vishap people Kokomi and others quickly dismissed. So it wouldn't be unheard of for them to be able to simply change form at will. While thinking on this, I found myself standing there in the river, hanging out with the Vishaps with the weirdest sense of glee, thinking, haha, nature is healing. And all of this brings me to another thought. The whole main Archon quest was about Focalor and Farina's incredibly long performance. They set out to fool the heavenly principles and succeeded. What even the eldest Archons fear to do, they managed. And in doing so, I believe solidified which side is which. Genshin is pretty good about making a hard truth that many people have trouble learning quite clear. There is good and bad in every person. Even a murderer can offer their hand to someone in need out of kindness. Even a saint can commit a heinous act when he thinks someone isn't watching. but I think this was the final nail in the coffin for the Celestia and the Heavenly Principles aren't the bad guys crowd. I'm sure that, in the end, it won't be so black and white. Hoyoverse is committed to trying to impart this lesson in nearly every one of their main flagship games, after all, that every creature has a reason for doing what they've done. Even the criminals we assisted in sending to Meripede in the Archon quest had reasons, some even good and understandable reasons for doing what they did, but their crimes were still crimes. I really hope we do, in fact, get to see Neuillette carry out Focalor's last wish someday. The Heavenly Principles themselves brought to trial for stealing the power of the sovereigns who are the rightful rulers of Teyvat. Neuillette especially gives us an important view into this conflict. Before now, we've only had the words of the rather pious civilization of Byakuya Koku to go by, and now, through Apep and Neuillette, we see the subjugated people's side. And despite it being ancient history, the quote that came with Neuvillette's character introduction suggests that this conflict is far from over. Someday, when they return, their true ordeal shall begin. And now on to other things. Further exploration into the Narcissenkreuz Ordo's story is largely character and exploration driven, but there are a few texts and bits of info that are worth mentioning. Most of these are tidbits of text found in the Tower of Gestalt, the mention of which makes me wail and gnash my teeth regularly because I am a massive Near Gestalt, Near Replicant fan, if you know you know. The first one that I want to cover is found near the teleport waypoint and reads as follows. The Tower of Episimus comes from an old concept from the ancient Fontainian kingdom of Remuria, and was used to describe a powerful will that could rule, sustain, and destroy the world. The tower was designed by the Narcissenkreuz Ordo, and it represents the evolution of the human soul and the infinite mysteries of the world. The Narcissenkreuz Ordo believes that people continuously refine themselves through samsara cycles. These include Hyperborea, Atlantean, Remuria, and the first half of the fourth samsara cycle, Kron Aria, which we are presently experiencing. Please take note that these are just names given to these eras by the Ordo based on ancient texts, and this evolution refers to spiritual evolution. There is no intent here to antagonize any research results obtained by the academia. The human spirit undergoes the loss of paradise, the defeat of evil dragons, the original sin and baptism, and finally, freedom from the gods. This isn't new information, actually. It just gives names to the concepts we already had. If you've ever read the flavor text of the various elemental circlets that the world bosses drop, you should. This is the Ordo's answer to the world cycles that are described within those artifacts. These concepts are pretty common in occultism in the real world. A lot of New Age beliefs that are borrowed, altered, and remixed versions of indigenous beliefs and myths about the way the world is created and destroyed in an endless cycle echo in this. And from what I can tell, the Narcissenkreuz Ordo storyline is kind of an ode to all of this kind of spooky New Age occultism a la Aleister Crowley's Golden Dawn and various other neo-pagan ideas and groups that sprung up in the 1800s and beyond. It also echoes Hermeticism, specifically in the various processes that one must refine the self through in order to reach perfection, the final stage being that of the Philosopher's Stone, which Albedo also references. I have some theories on these samsara cycles, but I'll try to keep it short before I just get way too long-winded for a single video. Hyperborea translates to Beyond Boreas, Boreas being god of the north wind, obviously, but the translation by itself doesn't tell us everything. The idea of Hyperborea in ancient Greece was that of the home of a super race that lived in the far north. Despite their lands being surrounded by the Arctic cold, their own country was blessed by the gods and was verdant and green and prosperous. Later scholars would consider this to be a myth that had in part explained the existence of the peoples of Scandinavia. The idea of Hyperborea as a promised land is also tied to the cult of Apollo and its secrets. This is further supported by the fact that the legends often talk of the sun in Hyperborea only rising and setting once a year, tying it to the phenomenon of the white night in the Arctic Circle, where the sun does not fully set at all for a set time of the year. And where else do we hear that term? Well, I made the connection only because my Japanese teacher taught us a difficult word on a whim one day that stuck with me for years. The word, byakuya, which is the Japanese word for that phenomenon, the white night. And where else do we hear that word? Byakuya Koku. So perhaps the first samsara connects to the era of Delphi before it became Byakuya-koku or Enkanomiya. As these names were given by the Ordo after the fact, I don't think it's that much of a stretch. It could also perhaps simply refer to the far north where Snezhnaya is located. There's further context if you read the description of each piece of the circular root cycle key you need to progress into the lowermost parts of the tower as well. Part A. The innermost circle is the circle of Hyperborea, symbolizing the age when the world was frozen and the lost paradise. The Lost Paradise definitely feels like some kind of connection to, if not the city of Delphi itself, then at least the era of civilization from which Byakuya-koku came. The second samsara is called Natlantean. This seems to almost be a play on words, or maybe just the best way to say of Natlan. If it's a play on words, the obvious reference would be to Atlantis, but we already have two of those in-game through Enkanomiya and Remuria, so maybe not. Natlantean is a nice descriptor. I've had a personal linguistic beef with monstatter as a word since day one. This one has a lot fewer context clues we can pull from because we know very little about Natlan, but if the first samsara refers to the time period when Byakuya-koku was on the surface, then the second samsara, referring to the time after that, would be referring to a time of great war and strife, so Natlan being the nation of war makes that rather fitting. The reference in the root cycle piece leaves me wondering what exact conflict it's referring to, but I assume it could be a reference either to the subjugation of the Seven Sovereigns or even the Archon War. Its root cycle piece reads, "The middle circle is the cycle of Natlantean, symbolizing the triumph over the evil dragon, a metaphor for humanity's victory over nature as well as the beasts within themselves." The existence of the nation of Remuria under God King Remus seems to encapsulate entirely the third samsara, which makes sense for how much importance the Ordo put on Remuria and its wisdom. Again, I think we'll unravel at least some of these mysteries in upcoming patches due to the fact that we're almost sure to go and explore the Sunken City at some point. The third and final part of the root cycle is both the Remurian cycle and the current era. The third circle and outermost half-circle are the cycles of Remuria and Kron Aria, symbolizing the relationship between humans and gods. The current samsara seems to be named directly for Conria, and represents everything from the Calamity onward. While there are a few other interesting snippets coming from this world quest and its branches, including Marianne name-dropping several locations we may or may not want to keep an eye out for, the ancient city of Yith, Arcadia, and Golden Hyperborea, we know virtually nothing about any but the last one, so those will remain mysteries to us for now. Next, I want to jump back to Skirk and some of the other info she dumped on us about her master, Sirtologi. The other name drop, Verderfalnir, is from the same mythology. Sirtologi refers to the fire of Sirt, the world ender, basically the final cause of the true end of the world in Ragnarok, and Verderfalnir is a hawk that perches between the eyes of an eagle, that sits in the branches at the top of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and is associated with knowledge. The name means wind witherer. Skirk mentions these names all in one breath, suggesting that they are beings of equal status and power to her master, and says that they are all alike in seeking some form of perfection. The visionary is most likely Mona's master and a member of the Hexen Circle, Barbeloth Trismegistus. Right now, this is all mostly gibberish to us lore-wise, but now we know to keep our eyes and ears open for these new names. And Sirtologi is a very ominous name to have crop up, as in the end of the story of Ragnarok, it is Sirt's fire that obliterates the world. It's also yet another mythological weapon name like Daneslave. We also see, once again, the use of Norse myth to hint to us the origins of these people. Most things associated with Conria, which I still theorize was born from a mix of refugees from Salvin-Dagnar, also known as the Dragonspine civilization, and the refugees of other nearby celestial nail disasters due to the use of Nordic naming conventions. This also circles me back around to our little tea break with Nicole of the Hexen Circle, and the rather pointed use of the same phrase that Daneslave uses to allude to Conria in the very first real story teaser we ever got. In places where the god's gaze does not fall. So while there are always more things I could dive into, I think this covers the main things I was really impressed upon by, and for the rest of the video I'm going to do a kind of rapid fire round of just questions I still have that are unanswered. How exactly was Neuillette born? He's at least 500 years old, and has served as the Iudex of Fontaine for around 400 years. Though we're not 100% certain of his exact age, we know his birthday is December 18th. This is recorded to be the day that the Yuan dynasty in China was founded, when its founder, Kublai Khan, gave his empire this name. If this holds any symbolic meaning, it might simply be a nod to Neuillette's role as a symbol of regime change in the world. Other than that, we can't say much about his date of birth. The prophecy about the Hydros sovereign said he would be reborn as a human, but that leaves us asking, did Neuillette have parents? Would they have not been human? Where did he live in his first 100 or so years of life before Fosseler's mysterious letter inviting him to the opera arrived? I doubt these kinds of questions will ever be answered, but it doesn't stop me from asking them in earnest. I just think it's fascinating. I guess he could have been born like the Melusines and just sprung to life somewhere in the same way his Vishaps children seem to do on Irenaeus, but I'm just so curious. What's the point of a reborn as a human prophecy if the person in question isn't actually born like a human? Thinking back on all of my pondering with regard to the Narcissan Croix Ordo, we still don't know why Jacob and Renee's bodies were special, closer to the Archons than the rest of the Fontainians, and therefore able to warp and change in ways that the average citizen couldn't. My only theory here, and it's a weak one, is that they were created from Oceanids who were perhaps Loch Knights or part of Egeria's personal entourage like Fosseler. Neuillette's various dialogue options at the end of the Archon quest bring up the Fountain of Lucine being the source of the cycle of rebirth for Oceanid, so maybe it's not that far-fetched. What is Neuillette's connection to Elenis, if any? If they're unrelated, why are Melusines born of Elenis classified by Neuillette as Vishaps? Does this mean that my theory about Durin could also apply to Elenis? It seems more and more likely that Scylla from the text of Remuria was not the Hydra sovereign. Perhaps Elenis, corrupted by the forbidden knowledge King Nibelung collected, ended up lost in the abyss as well until Rhindaughter found and unleashed him. If it weren't for the fact that Elenis' will and soul is still perfectly present inside of his corpse, I'd theorize that Elenis was the corrupted former Hydra sovereign. But there are just too many complications with that. Hopefully, future world quests give us some clarification on this. I don't know, who am I to judge? Maybe Neuillette and Elenis are just two asexually reproducing dads with lots of kids and I am overthinking it. I found myself thinking back to Enconomius' experiments on Vishaps, and the fact that they recorded that none of the ones they had tried to selectively breed or force to evolve through various unethical torture ever took on the pyro aspect. It also talks about the Vishaps rejecting infusions of Orobashi's blood because they were of the light realm, while Orobashi and his vassals were of the human realm. All of these experiments were halted when they realized they had subjects able to speak clearly with the level of a 12-year-old child. This, of course, brings to mind Passive, who had learned some simple words and phrases from Neuillette, but had not come that close to coherency. This suggests that it's quite possible for even common Vishaps to learn human speech. My theory on this is just that the only type of Vishap trapped in Enconomia when the cave-in happened were bathymal in nature, and they were only able to mutate into cryo and electro mutations for whatever reason. The whole chaos of the prophecy in Fontaine is pretty interesting. There are some parts I still can't get my head around, like, why use some prophecy as punishment when it wouldn't be enacted for another several hundred years, well after the original person who committed a sin was dead? This makes me feel like Salvin Dagner was some kind of isolated incident or even a mistake of some sort. Everyone's rehashed Salvin Dagner to death, but we know that the text on the mountain tells us that the celestial nail was already present on top of the mountain for some unknown amount of time before it became a catastrophe. At first, the people seemed to regard it as a boon from the gods. It was only when one day it suddenly shattered without warning and crushed the silver-white tree that grew at the summit that anything bad happened to it. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. The nails have the power to cleanse the abyss from the land. This we've seen over and over, but they've also been known to have destructive effects. Once the nail on Salvin Dagner broke, the place was plunged into a harsh eternal winter that eventually killed everyone who didn't flee. The nail in the chasm is harder to pin down, as it appears to be mostly undamaged but also no longer successfully clearing the filth from the abyss, which was shown to contain memories of people from Conria gushing back up to the surface. Then there's the nail that fell in the desert of Hadramaveth that Apep mentioned, and from the text in the Flower of Paradise Lost artifact set, we know that it fell and killed Nabu Malikata when she decided to sacrifice herself to give King Deshret the forbidden knowledge he sought. Another case of this, we know not one but several nails fell on Surumi Island via the Thunderbird Kana Kapatshir's testimony. Perhaps one nail for all three of the hollow corkscrew mountain-type formations. All of those are nowhere to be seen, and the Golden Wolf Lord, the big bad of the Rift Wolves, has managed to make the place its lair, so those are clearly not functioning either. All we really know about the pre-Thunderbird civilization is that they worshipped the moons and left a final warning on a mural to not challenge the heavens. The Thunderbird civilization came after that fog appeared, which the inhabitants believed protected them from the darkness outside. Again, this has very little further explanation. That leads us back to Deshret and the fact that we know he hunted down the nail that fell on Nabu Malikata and used it to create the Eternal Oasis where the leyline sprout that matches all of the others at nail drop sites is located. So, if Celestia has been known to drop nails directly on an offending god when they break the law, what the heck is going on in the current era? How could Focalor get away with what she did? Okay, so let's say she found the perfect loophole, that's one thing, but the Dragon Sovereigns are becoming active again left and right, and Neuillette being the most powerful of the others at the moment, even Apep doesn't have her full dragonhood as her power was stolen to make the seat of the Dendro Archon. Shouldn't Celestia be moving in some way, shape, or form, at the very least, be concerned that its ancient foe is very close to rising against them? Neuillette considers his duty to Fontaine's people first and foremost, but his voice lines and character story make it pretty clear that he won't pass up a chance to pass judgment on Celestia, so... More and more, I'm wondering if there's just no one at home up there. In short, why was Egeria's successor punished by a prophecy that took over 500 years to complete rather than just punish Egeria and her newborn creations? Was it perhaps some kind of mercy from the heavens to let them live that long? Are they out of nails? It doesn't seem likely, as you can see two things that resemble them when you look at the 3D model. I don't know. I still have more questions than answers. Keep in mind that when the Hydra Sovereign was either slain or removed from power, Egeria was created as a new being, purely for the sake of being the heart of the primordial sea and keeping it under control. Like Venti, she's confirmed to be created directly by one of the Primordial One's shades, the as-of-yet unnamed Shade of Life, while Venti is a single strand of the Thousand Winds of Istaroth, the Shade of Time. It seems like Egeria served some kind of important purpose, much like Ruka Devata as the avatar of Irminsul, and was likely given her seed as an Archon rather than having to fight directly for it. So, why would what she did be considered stealing? I can only guess it has something to do with universal laws that we know nothing about. I'm gonna call it here before I start getting any more convoluted. 4.2 gave us so much to think about and chew on, and we haven't even touched on the new context to consider with regard to Tartaglia or the Hexen Circle itself. There's just so much here that one video can't contain it. Narratively, this pushes us closer and closer to the climax of our story. If our usual patch cycle is anything to go by, we're sure to get some ancient ruins that tell us more about Remuria, and then later on a visit from Daneslave, and his quests never miss. I'm so thrilled to finally be getting some of the answers to questions I've asked aloud on this very channel in the past. I hope that my meandering thoughts gave you some new things to think about on the way. This is, as always, the Hexen Circle signing off. We hope you'll join us on our next adventure.